Hi everyone, I'm Elena Curia, CEO and founder of Elemed, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the regulatory professional of the future. So the first thing we're going to look into is, what is a regulatory professional? We're going to understand, what do career routes of today look like for regulatory professionals? What are the skill sets of tomorrow? And then how to be future-proof. So let's jump right in. What is a regulatory professional? Actually, let me ask a question. If you were to ask the people in your company that are not working in your department, do you know what a regulatory professional does? What percentage of them would say yes? And what percentage of them would say no? Do you have a clean, clear elevator pitch so that people can understand what it is that you do? I've got a really good word for regulatory professionals, and that is obviously superheroes. But in terms of the elevator pitch, I've been working on it for the last 9 years, perfecting and tweaking what I believe the role of a regulatory professional to be. And that is the people that solve regulatory problems to get medical products out to patients all over the world and to ensure that they are safe and effective. Regulatory affairs is not a siloed position. It's a role that interfaces with many other partners, both internally and externally within a company. Some of them you can see on your screen right now. But for those of the people out there that believe that regulatory affairs is not a revenue generating function and is a cost center, I would argue that regulatory affairs is a business enabler. It is a function that is critical to ensure that a company is able to sell its products. Without a strong regulatory affairs function, companies would not be able to achieve success and to actually be able to sell their products in those markets. So let's talk about the career routes of today that regulatory professionals have and the biggest myth associated with them. But before we do that, I want to talk to you about job titles, because you may have seen recently on LinkedIn a debate that came out of one of my videos highlighting the fact that job titles in regulatory are not consistent. Looking over some of the placements that we've made over the last few years, here are some of the titles associated relative to years of experience. So your entry-level role, your 0 to 3 years of experience, can be called anything from expert, specialist, regulatory officer, regulatory manager, regulatory engineer. From 3 to 5 years, we basically see the same thing: regulatory expert, specialist, regulatory officer. So note that there's actually, in terms of title, no clear distinction between somebody that has 1 year of experience and somebody that has 5 years. And equally, for 5 years plus, so somebody who's a single contributor, but may have 10 years of experience in regulatory affairs, equally, they could be called a senior expert, a senior regulatory specialist, a senior regulatory manager, and note there that that could equally be somebody that only has 2 years of experience. At the same time, they could be called director regulatory affairs without having any people management responsibilities, or even be called head of regulatory affairs because they have a senior level of experience, regardless of whether or not they have people management responsibilities. So there is no true consistency when it comes to titles. When it comes to managing people, it could be anything from manager, senior specialists could also manage people, team leaders, heads of, director. And another big thing is around cultural differences. So we see distinctly differences when it comes to title between Europe, the US in particular. What we find in Europe is that job titles are much more traditional and typically a little bit more conservative. Companies in Europe will typically only have one VP of regulatory, and that VP will be the top person within the company that reports into a C-level function. Whereas in the US, we tend to find that companies can have multiple VPs. And typically, when we are benchmarking seniority and years of experience and scope of experience, what we typically would find is that somebody that in the US may be called director, may be the equivalent of a senior manager in Europe, and equally a VP in Europe may be a senior VP in the US. And finally, we don't have any consistency in regulatory affairs when it comes to company sizes. So somebody in a startup might be called a vice president, and that role looks completely different to a vice president in a large corporate. Equally, a mid-sized company might not have a vice president, might just have a head of, or might just have a manager reporting into a CEO. And so we have massive inconsistencies when it comes to job titles. So then the question is, how do we actually differentiate between the different levels when looking at regulatory professionals? At Elemed, we have three main things that we look at. The first is reporting structure. So actually, what does the organizational structure look like, and where does that person fit in to it? What are the scope of that person's responsibilities? What type of budget do they manage? What decision-making power do they have? And also really trying to understand, what does that team size look like? So let's talk about career progression of today. We polled 136 regulatory professionals and asked them a simple question: do you have a career progression plan? And 76% of them said no, they do not. In regulatory, there is a myth that exists that basically says in order to progress, you need to move up. Actually, that is not the case. Here within Elemed, we clearly distinguish three clear career progression paths that regulatory professionals can follow. The first is the expert. The expert is all around becoming senior but specialized in the details of what a regulatory role looks like. The second is the leadership route, which is your more classic idea of career progression, which is moving upwards. And the third is what we call the independent route. And this is associated with contracting and freelancing that I will dig into in a little bit more detail right now. So let's go one by one. And I'm going to talk you through what that career progression looks like. And we're going to hit some of the advantages and disadvantages associated with each one of them. So route one, the expert. Typically somebody would come into regulatory affairs. They'd move into some sort of specialist role. Specialists would typically work on country registrations, maybe starting first of all with slightly more simpler countries where regulations are less, let's say there is more flexibility, and then moving into some more complicated country regulatory activities, for example, CE marking in Europe, equally focusing on PMA or 510K activities with the US, looking more into challenging countries within Asia, such as Japan, and also countries like Brazil. From senior specialist, what you might find is that the senior specialist is developing a range of different experiences, both working on different geographies, but equally maybe developing what we call vertical skills within regulatory. So for example, working on a new product introduction, maybe for example, working on lifecycle management, maybe working on special projects like MDR implementation. And the senior specialist will kind of stay at that level, and we'll move to a new company, work on some new projects, work on some new products, and basically repeat that cycle over and over again. Another route within the expert is from senior specialist to move into a new type of role, which is called regulatory intelligence, which is really linked closely to monitoring global regulations and feeding that back into the team. From there, there's also an opportunity to move more towards government policy and advocacy type of regulatory activities. There's also an opportunity, if that person has some sort of R&D background, to move into a notified body and actually move out of a manufacturer. Also moving out of manufacturers, there's an opportunity to move into consultancy. So when I talk about consultancy, I'm talking about working for an organization that is providing solutions to companies, but being permanently employed by that consultancy. What does that mean? You get all the benefits of being permanently employed, you receive a salary, you don't do sales and marketing, but actually what you do is delivery of projects that are given to you by that consultancy. Or there's even an opportunity to move to what we call competent authority, so the regulators, and move back And this is something that we see, by the way, not only in regulatory affairs in healthcare, but we see this in all sorts of regulatory roles in various different industries, especially in more developed industries, like, for example, highly regulated industries such as chemicals. The hot skills when it comes to experts right now is new product introduction experience, support to new product development projects, working on cradle to grave regulatory activities. So from idea, from concept to market, all the way through to post-market activities. The most requested experience is experience with the US, PMA and 510K. And from a product perspective, companies tend to be really interested in candidates that have experience with high-risk devices, software as a medical device, and active medical devices and associated scope. So knowledge of standards such as electrical safety standards and usability. The career progression associated to the expert route is really more around a variety of projects and actually geographical scope, the complexity of the products that you're working on, so the risk classification associated with them, working in different company sizes. So what a regulatory role might look like in a startup would be very different to one in a global corporate. And also by having a nice variety of experience working in different company types, not just manufacturers, but also either consultancies or notified bodies. Route number 2 is obviously the leadership route. So the leadership route starts off quite similar to the expert route because obviously it's usually very important that the person has built a solid foundation of technical competence and understanding. But then what will happen is kind of at the senior specialist level, once they have the experience with Europe and the US, once they've done, manage their own projects from cradle to grave, this person would typically take on maybe initially mentoring, but then move towards managing 2 to 3 people at some sort of team leader level. They would then build their team out to about 5 people. And this is really where the person's opportunities within the leadership route really open up. The first option would be for this person to move into some sort of head of, director, leadership role for a mid-sized company. Now, the thing to note is when you're moving from a regulatory role where you're managing a team of 5 people into a medium-sized company, you typically will have to pick up another discipline underneath what you're doing. So typically it would be quality, but for some companies, it might also be clinical, it might be regulatory and post-market, for example, but typically it wouldn't be enough to just only have regulatory. You would need to diversify as you step into a mid-sized company to have a broader scope of responsibility. And from there, you could follow that route within a mid-size to report to a CEO and to basically have everything responsible for regulatory and quality. The thing to really know is that there's a big difference between reporting to a VP of regulatory and reporting to a CEO. The actual style of communication needs to be completely different. Successful candidates that really navigate that move to reporting directly to CEOs and encompassing everything underneath regulatory, quality, potentially clinical in a mid-sized company, generally have good business awareness and are able to communicate regulatory concepts in terms of impact on revenue and on the business. Cycling back to that regulatory manager of 5+ people, there's an opportunity to move into a startup company, maybe to have 1 direct report, maybe to have none, but typically to be the top person within a startup looking after all activities for regulatory, quality and clinical. Typically, this person is reporting to the CEO. And within a startup, the role of regulatory affairs is very different. You would be looking after much less products, but you would have a much wider scope of activities. You would also be responsible for doing things that don't necessarily fall into your job description, because with a startup, everything is about being hands-on, being reactive and being and proactive, of course, but reactive to problems and being a very good problem solver. But equally, there's an opportunity to stay within kind of the corporate structure and move into associate director. Again, the associate director could make the move to startup. and to follow the more classic path to, you know, director within a global corporate company, only looking after regulatory affairs. Again, having the opportunity to move to a mid-size, but then also picking up another discipline, or staying within a big global corporate and moving within what we call one vertical, which is regulatory, to a VP, and then potentially moving into that top senior VP level that reports into the senior leadership and is typically part of the senior leadership. One thing to note is once you have gone past VP level in a big global corporate, it becomes very difficult to make a move to a startup company, both because financially it would be a significant step back, but also in terms of the hands-on approach. Typically, when you're working at VP level, you have very good overview of the strategy and very good leadership skills, but you tend to take a step away from the day-to-day work, which then makes such a move much more complex. But it makes you a great candidate to stay within that corporate network and move from one big corporate to the next at senior VP or VP level. Hot skills when it comes to leadership, especially experience reporting to CEO or experience reporting to commercial functions outside of regulatory affairs. Good, strong regulatory understanding, but a good understanding as well of the business and this concept of regulatory being a business enabler and being directly linked to revenue activities. Experience around culture change and transformation from a regulatory and quality perspective. What that means is really changing reputation within the company from policeman to partner, and having experience doing that and driving that change. Multi-layer management, so managing managers, and also remote leadership, because regulatory is obviously one of those roles that lends itself really, really nicely to home office work. And so more and more in leaders, companies are looking for people that have proven experience of actually managing people remotely and a demonstrated success from doing that. So let's talk about the independent. You'd start by entering into regulatory, following some sort of expert route, exiting, and then moving into the independent. So this would be what we call the contractor. Now, the contractor is typically very hands-on, working in the details of regulatory. They would be either managing multiple projects by themselves, or they would be on site at a client for a specific period of time, call it 3-6 months, working fully dedicated to that client, but they would essentially be self-employed. The other route within independent is to follow a leadership route, exit at VP level, and then to become what we call a consultant. Note that there is ambiguity, especially in the European markets, where consultants and contractors, the word consultant is used to encompass both, but actually there is a clear distinction in terms of the roles that are associated with each. The contractor is much on hands-on delivery in the details of regulatory affairs, where the consultant, typically and traditionally, is much more focused on strategy and maybe also working on some ad interim VP replacement activities, but much more focusing on the leadership side and much less on the execution. Now, one thing to note is that route 3 is traditionally seen as the more risky of all 3 routes. So we're going to dig into that in a second. But first, let me highlight the hot skills. So the hot skills associated with the independent: sales skills, personal branding and marketing skills, strong content creation skills, ability to be entrepreneurial, ability to have obviously key areas of specialisms, and to be unafraid to keep repeating the same type of project over and over again. An ability for commercial awareness, because typically you might be working directly with CEOs, especially if you're dealing with startup companies. And obviously right now, MDR is a sought after area of experience. However, note that this is something for the now, when the market is really good, but in the future, supply and demand will be reversed. So there is risk associated with it. Let's look at the pros and cons. So for the expert, the positives: you have job stability, it's much more secure, you have your holidays paid, you have a wide variety of activities, you become a true go-to person, the company will invest in your training and development, at no cost to you. However, it can be a bit repetitive at time, and you will typically over the long term see less of a big salary increase as you move from role to role. If we talk about the leader, of course, you have the job stability. You tend to see bigger salary increases as you move from role to role. Obviously, you have the recognition that comes with being a leader within the business and the satisfaction that is associated with that. However, it is highly competitive. There are many more experts wanting to become leaders than there are experts wanting to stay experts. So actually the competition is much higher, whereas at expert level, there are many more opportunities. At leadership level, there are less. It's a very high pressure job. And of course, the further up you go, the further away you get from the actual regulatory daily activities. So if you're somebody that really loves the complexity of the projects, the products, the details, really consider if leadership route is one for you. And finally, the independent, which is really popular right now. It gives you a lot more flexibility. Generally, you make more money. You can be your own boss. You can choose your projects. However, there's high risk. There is no job security. Typically, when companies need to make cuts, they look first at what projects they can cut, and that directly impacts, obviously, independence. There are no paid holidays and insurance by the company. And word of mouth isn't enough. You need to be good at sales and marketing in order to ensure a constant stream of projects. And, you know, always be looking out for your next project, because it's never guaranteed that your existing project will go all the way until the end. So let's talk about career routes of tomorrow and the most desired skill set. And let's focus first in on the factors. What factors are really driving the future? Obviously, we see tech giants entering healthcare. There's always going to be an ever-increasing regulatory burden, more and more, as we move into the future. Automation and technology advances are impacting every single industry, as is globalization, and the world is actually becoming a smaller place. At the same time, if we look at the workforce, we have younger generations coming through that value different things. Gone is the concept that you should stay in your company and a career is a career for life. Younger generations are more interested in flexibility and purpose, and typically are more, or let's say less afraid of taking risks. Companies are starting to allow more remote working, which is going to give them access to a remote talent pool, which will make positions more competitive. Companies are already doing much more when it comes to personality profiling and using data around soft skills and personality to help them evaluate, number one, cultural fit, number two, team fit, and number three, fit for the role. We also see an increase towards the gig economy. So this is companies wanting to be able to scale up and scale down much faster with less commitment. Also, candidates wanting more flexibility and freedom to choose when, where, how they work. So leaning more towards this independent route, which obviously comes with its risks, as discussed. And also we have much more visibility, both from a candidate and a company perspective, with social media, LinkedIn playing a part, and also company review sites like Glassdoor. And then, of course, there's all the other things that I don't know. So the unknown unknowns that will be coming up and will be impacting what the future looks like. And the other key thing that we need to consider is the speed at which all of this is changing and the speed at which information is now readily accessible. Because information is much more accessible than what it's ever been, the focus from companies will be changing. I'm going to talk more about that in a second. But first, let's talk about Google. Google undoubtedly is a company that is really living in the future. And this is Lisa, who is the global staffing lead and senior recruiter at Google. And she spoke about what Google do when it comes to actually evaluating candidates for roles. They look at four things. Number one, general cognitive ability, which essentially is problem solving skills. Number two, leadership. So how do you influence others and how do you inspire people to follow your way of thinking? Googliness, which is culture fit. And finally, role-related knowledge. The most important thing that Google values when evaluating candidates, obviously you need to have all four, but the most important is problem solving and general cognitive availability, because the belief is that actually what they're looking for is somebody that is able to deal with problems as and when they come, and is not specifically fixed to one specific role, but is able, as roles change, because they do dynamically at Google, it's moving and growing so fast that a job description can very quickly become outdated. So the question is, what skills, tendencies, and attitudes are we recruiting for to ensure that that person has a place within the company, even if a job description changes? And this is not only something that Google is doing, it's something that we're actually seeing in healthcare and in regulatory affairs. So earlier in June, I polled over 200 hiring managers and asked them the question, what do you prioritize between soft skills, communication skills, technical know-how, and certificates? And here is the result. 62% valued great communication style as more important than technical know-how, obviously considering that candidates had all three of these, similar to Google. What we're seeing here is a shift from specialism to attitudes and to communication style and to ways of thinking. And this is going to actually be what we're going to see leading into the future. So the career progression path of tomorrow is going to be some sort of combination of all the three that we've seen. What we can be sure of is that it's going to be much more vague and fluid. It's not going to be so linear as what we've seen until now. What you can expect is that there's going to be more cross-functional working, more interdisciplinary teams. Job descriptions are going to be things of the past, but actually roles are going to be based, focusing more on solving certain problems, working on certain projects, and focus on getting certain outcomes rather than just describing a list of responsibilities. Career progression paths will be less linear. They're going to be much more fluid. Company structures will be more matrixed. Companies will use more lattice structures. And when it comes to in-demand skill sets, I like to look at what Vikram said. He's a Harvard University lecturer. And he talks about the key skill of the future is actually not a skill. It's more an approach, a philosophy, and a way of thinking. Particularly when it comes to regulatory affairs, and this is something that we are already seeing, companies are hiring for attitude and approach. And these are the following attitudes and approaches that they are looking for on top of experience. Solution-orientated approach. Here's how we can, not here's why we can't. Ability to see the bigger picture. Do you understand how regulatory directly impacts business and sales? And do you see regulatory as a business enabler or a cost center? Problem-solving skills. What experience and examples do you have of how have you worked through a problem that you haven't encountered before, and how would you do that in the future? Sales, communication, and leadership skills are more important than ever because nowadays everything is around how you communicate, lead, and influence. So how persuasive can you be? Are you able to bring people round to your way of thinking? And finally, agility and flexibility. How comfortable are you with being uncomfortable? So we've spoken about the skill set of the future, and it's not actually going to be a technical skill, but rather leading more into attitudes, approaches, and ways of thinking. Do you see regulatory as a business enabler? So where do you start? The first is know yourself and your strengths. Companies are evaluating your profile based on data. Do you know what your personality profile is? Do you know what your strengths and weaknesses are? Have you done a personality profiling test? If you haven't, get in touch with Elamed and we will do one for you. Secondly, do you have an idea of what your career route looks like? And actually, does that career route play to your personality strengths, what you're good at? And does it even fit? And thirdly, once you've done the first two things, consciously focus on building what I call a portfolio of experience relative to the route that you want to take. If it's the expert route, focus on developing a wide geographical experience with wide product types, high risk, active softwares, medical device, implantable, really focus on building out broad experience there. If it's leadership, focus on leading through different management styles, different organizational structures, lead through change, try to get experience working through change and culture transformation. Definitely try to get experience reporting not only into regulatory, but reporting closer into business functions. And if it's an independent, focus on really developing out your expertise in one or two key areas, build your professional LinkedIn profile, build your brand, and focus on sales and marketing activities. And so let me talk to you about how you can get more information. Obviously, the Elemed website, you can contact me, eleanor@elemed.eu. Follow our page for loads of tips, guidance, information. Check out our podcast, Career Diaries by Elemed. Follow me on LinkedIn. And also check out our Elemed Mentoring Academy in partnership with RAPS that will help you develop out these skills that we have discussed. Thank you, everybody. I hope you found this useful. Have a great day. Goodbye.